This is Dr. Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 9 of season 6 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. Today we'll be talking with Dr. Winston Ewert about the new edition of the Design Inference. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Audible, Google Podcast, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Winston Ewert. Dr. Ewert earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Science from Trinity Western University, his Master's degree from Baylor University in Computer Science, and he earned a PhD from Baylor University in Electrical and Computer Engineering. Dr. Winston is the author of 22 technical publications in various journals, symposiums, and conferences, such as the journal Biocomplexity, the 42nd Southeastern Symposium on System Theory, University of Texas at Tyler, and the International Conference on Systems, Man, and Cybernetics. Dr. Ewert is a software engineer with various specialties, including computer simulations of evolution, specified complexity, information theory, and the common design of genomes. He's also a researcher for the Scientific Theory of Intelligent Design, a senior fellow of Discovery Institute's Walter Bradley Center on Natural and Artificial Intelligence, a senior research scientist at the Biologic Institute, a senior researcher at the Evolutionary Informatics Lab, and a fellow of the Bradley Center. Finally, he's the co-author with Dr. William Dembski of the second edition of the book, The Design Inference, Eliminating Chance Through Small Probabilities, which we'll be covering in today's interview. And now, without further ado, good afternoon, Dr. Ewert. How was your day, and how are you doing?
It's been a good day. It's going well so far, and I'm happy to be back on with you.
It's wonderful to see you again, Dr. Ewert. Thank you for coming on Current Topics in Science. And since this is Current Topics in Science, let's quickly take a look at this week's current topic. This week, we'll be taking a look at an article of our mutual friend, Dr. Brian Miller, called Dembski Won the Argument with His Critics. A new edition of the Design Inference shows how. Dr. Miller says, most recently, Dembski partnered with Ewert to write a second, greatly expanded edition of the Design Inference, which is being released today. The new edition represents the culmination of decades of thought and research. It presents a rigorous and reliable procedure for detecting design in any context. Such analyses demonstrate evidence for design that is now so clear and rigorous that for intellectually honest and sincere seekers of the truth, denying is no longer feasible. So with that being said, Dr. Ewert, can you tell us what exactly is the design inference, as in the concept?
So the design inference as the concept is the logic by which we decide that things are designed, particularly why we think that things didn't happen by chance and that they're designed. And we actually sort of do this in our everyday life, even though you might not sort of think of it as this lofty idea of a design inference. But you come home and your house has been organized, and you conclude that someone cleaned up your house. You don't conclude that a whirlwind came in your house and put everything away. Right? You make a design inference. You go to a beach and you find, someone has built a sandcastle there. You don't think, oh, look at what the wind and the waves did. They built this cool little sandcastle. You think, no, someone designed and filled up sand and built the sandcastle. So the design inference is just the question of, well, how do we do this? How do we decide that this is design? We don't look at every beach in the world and think, someone carefully graded this beach. No, we know that happens by natural processes, but sandcastles don't. And so in our everyday life, we just do this. We draw these design inferences. And that is, of course, the subject of the book. What is the logic by which we're drawing these design inferences? And that's the design inference.
Thank you for explaining that, Dr. Ewert. So now that we know what the design inference is, as in the concept, let's explore the book titled The Design Inference. In Dr. Miller's article, he quotes praise of the book from Princeton University mathematician Sergio Kleinerman, who described the book by saying, well, argued and eminently readable. I don't see how any open-minded scientist can ignore this important book. It sounds like the book's already making quite an impact, and so with that in mind, what can readers look forward to in the second edition? What's new?
So, of course, if readers haven't read the first edition, they can look forward to an explication of the design inference, an exploration of specified complexity, when we can infer design and what the logic is behind that. In particular, changes from the first edition. It's greatly expanded. It's about twice the size of the first edition, and hopefully, from your perspective, that's a positive. It has actually, in many ways, simplified from the first edition. We've actually taken some of the more complex stuff and reduced them to simpler ways of looking at it. Just we've had time to refine and better understand the logic of the design inference. So it's much simpler. There's just a lot better, clearer explanation. The original one was an adaptation of a dissertation. This one has a lot more work being readable, I think, even to a lay audience. There is, some mathematics in it, so you might have to skip over those sections if you're not mathematically inclined. But I think much of the book should actually be very readable to a lay audience. There's a lot more things in this edition, developing sort of practical examples and sort of understandable things that people will be familiar with instead of just a theoretical development. And there's also just better and more complete theoretical development in the book as well.
Thank you for explaining that, Dr. Ewert. It sounds like readers have a lot to look forward to. Speaking of which, when the first edition came out, critics attempted to point out what they saw as flaws in the book. And as Dr. Miller explains, in the decades that followed, Dembski responded to critics and refined his model. So Dr. Ewert, how have you and Dr. Dembski addressed criticisms and further clarified your position in the second edition of the book?
So in my view, most of the criticisms that get leveled at the first edition are the consequence of people not understanding what the first edition was saying. And to a certain degree, of course, those of us in the origins debate are used to people misunderstanding or perhaps even misrepresenting what we're saying. But, I think that the second edition takes advantage of, we know where people have misunderstood things. We've worked hard to clarify that. We've also just simplified it. So some people would complain about things in the first edition around the conditional dependence criterion or the tractability criterion or specification of resources. And we've just simplified it. So those things aren't even developed in the second edition. We just have a much simpler way of approaching the problem. Basically, the second edition just simplifies, clarifies, makes everything much simpler. And I think in doing so, basically addresses most of the objections that could have been raised against the first edition.
And speaking of objections, for the following question, I want to draw from one of my favorite quotes in the book. You and Dr. Dembski wrote, "If the design inference were confined to the effects of human agency, it would be uncontroversial." I love this quote because I know from experience that it's true. As someone who studied forensic science, I often use the fact that we can tell the difference between a house burning down due to an undirected natural cause like lightning strike or a gas leak versus a house that was burned down due to the actions of an intelligent agent, i.e. arson, to show that we can tell well and good that agency and design are detectable. Critics are okay with this analogy until I make the point that we can clearly detect an agent's design in the natural world. So Dr. Ewert, is it inappropriate to say that we can apply agency detection to nature, meaning the design inference is a category error? How exactly does one deduce agency from design?
I feel like I've never found someone offering an accusation of a category error that was accurate. Basically, people claiming things are category errors always comes across to me as attempting to sound philosophically sophisticated, but actually making a vacuous claim. Because a category error claims that something doesn't even make sense. It's like, talking about, numbers having colors or something. It doesn't make sense. But it's pretty clear that it's not logically incoherent to suggest that the world might have been created by some sort of intelligence. And so it's not a category error, that's just dumb. So certainly we should be able to apply agency detection to nature. We should be able to apply the same things we do in normal life to determine, was this arson? Did someone organize my house? Did someone build the sandcastle? The same basic principle ought to apply to the universe itself and everything in it. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to the same thing. We're always detecting agency by looking at, this is something that seems very unlikely, and it has a short description length, as we discussed in the second edition. Basically, it adheres to some sort of independent pattern. It's something we recognize. And so whether that is, this looks like someone had a bunch of fire starter and created arson, or this looks like someone built a sandcastle, or this organism looks like it's been very carefully designed to fly, or the laws of physics look like they've been very carefully put together. It's all the same basic pattern. It's all improbable and yet follows a simple description. It has some sort of pattern to it. And in all these cases, we infer design, except when we don't want to.
Thank you for addressing that, Dr. Ewert. We've now come to our final question. Indeed, the design inference has withstood the test of scientific scrutiny. And on that note, while the second edition of the book is now published by Discovery Institute Press, the first edition is still available for purchase on the Cambridge Press website, which is linked with the Amazon page in the description. I think that's because, despite what the critics may say, the design inference is useful. So outside of the ID discussion, how exactly is the design inference useful? Scientifically, religiously, or philosophically?
Right. So, we even just talked about the example with detecting arson. So obviously determining whether a house is built by arson is actually an application of design inference. And that's something pretty useful. We want to find out when there's actually arson so we can find the person responsible and prevent them from doing that again. It also could be something like you're walking through a forest and you're determining, is this a real path? That seems very practical and useful. And that is ultimately a design inference. Or you can do something like fraud detection. You want to know, is this like voter fraud or financial fraud where people are making up their numbers. You're looking for patterns and you're doing the same design inference thing. On a religious dimension, you could look at all of the prophecies that we would point to that Jesus fulfilled. Was that just random chance that Jesus fulfilled all these prophecies, or was there a design behind it? Now, I think it's pretty clear there was a design behind it, a divine plan to put all these prophecies in place and have them fulfilled. So I think all these are sort of different cases. Yeah, the design inference is everywhere, and we actually apply it all the time.
Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Ewert. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Dr. Ewert's biographical information, credentials, and written works in the description. You'll also find links to his numerous technical papers, his blog, and a link to the Christ Jesus Ministries merch store, along with the link to purchase the design inference. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.